this temple and this Sangha represents that perfect place to practice seva, service, and meditation, both and. Good morning, everyone. This is such a great topic that we're basically on this topic 2 weeks in a row, which is lovely. And I promised in my Sunday email, which goes out to, tell people about this Sunday, that I would talk a little bit about Swami Kriyananda's statement that seva is bliss in motion. Service is bliss in motion. And in his case, in his life, Yogananda told him when he was a young man, age 22, that he would have a life of intense service and meditation. And of course, many of you know that Kriyananda noted that Yogananda mentioned service first in that particular phrase, and his life certainly was an incredibly full life of service for his guru's teachings, Yogananda's teachings. He has another statement that he made, and that was when he was about in his 70s, I think, which is the age I am now, and he was giving a satsang at Ananda in Assisi, and it was about this topic of service. And he said, service, I know that service is my salvation. And that was a very powerful statement for him to make. Of course, he was outwardly incredibly serviceful, but recognizing, because his guru had also told him that death would be his final sacrifice, and recognizing how important service, or seva as it's known in Sanskrit, was his salvation. It's through service, through seva, that we are rubbing egos with others whom we're serving. And in that process, our egos can become refined. And so what happens is that, of course, we're trying to remember God as we're serving and be an instrument of divine light to those that we are serving. But the reality is, I don't know about you, but for most people I know, myself included, that the ability to focus and remember that in every second, in every moment, is as difficult to experience as it is to experience one pointed focus on God consistently in meditation. Because what happens, of course, is the mind gets a billion thoughts flowing through it. So we get glimmers, and I'm sure everyone in this room experiences those moments of complete stillness of mind and of heart. But they are the rare moments, and we sort of want to marry them together so that we can have more and more of them. But it takes practice. And so ultimately, the greatest benefactor of the service that we render is us, is our own soul, because it is a spiritual practice that will bring us to freedom. But we have to remember that and keep remembering that. It's a joy to be able to serve and try to be an instrument for the light. And that's what he was saying. He knew it was his salvation. So yesterday I was preparing for today, and I referred to this book by Swami Kriyananda called Promise of Immortality. It was originally intended that he would have 2 volumes, but basically it's the same thing as the readings that we do every week. It's the same topics, only he has a full chapter and essay expounding on it. And when he first wrote it, we were reading that at Sunday service. And it didn't take long for him to realize that it left very little, if hardly any time, for the ministers giving the service to say anything at all. And that wasn't appropriate. So he shortened it, and way shortened it to the readings that we have now. But this book of essays is invaluable because he's talking about the same topics. The other thing that happened is he never wrote volume 2. So we only have the first half of the year. So I quickly looked up, and this was week 20. So we're in, I was able to read about what he had to say on the topic. And what was most interesting to me is that he didn't entitle the chapter with the same title of today's reading, which is Activity versus Inner Communion. The chapter is entitled The One Thing Needful. Bullseye. He gave the solution of this dilemma in the chapter heading, the one thing needful. And yet the thing that is so difficult for us to maintain, in perpetuity, to be in that divine remembrance, which is what he was referring to, of course, as the one thing that's needful when we're in activity. What happens with most of our minds is they're, restless. We are restless. I am restless. And so what takes place is another line that I really enjoy in Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi, the restlessness of the oscillating mirror of the mind. He says to his college buddy who was not able to intuit Sri Yukteswar's change in plans the way Yogananda was, because he was attuned to his guru, Sri Yukteswar. So his buddy didn't get the message, didn't get the memo, and was annoyed with Yogananda and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And Yogananda said, "I couldn't help it that your restlessness created an oscillating mirror of the mind." There you have it. And that image brought me back to my own childhood. When we immigrated to America, I was 10, and it was 1960. And in the 60s, this was before video games, so what they had for children was fun houses. And you could go to a fun house, and everything in it was, upside down, you name it. It was a bizarre little experience to go in, and they always had these oscillating mirrors, right? And if you stand in front of that mirror, you're distorted. You look really distorted. And then I realized that, in fact, is what happens when we are when we're not in God remembrance. I'll state it in the semi-positive. When we're restless and our mind oscillates, we see distortions. We see these bodies. We see these buildings. We see everything appearing to be material, when, as the affirmation was saying today, it's all energy. And we're not able to see the divine hand because our minds are so restless. And Jesus, who was Martha's guru, wasn't reprimanding her because she was a bad person. He was reprimanding her because he knew she had the potential to understand. He was giving her a little corrective, which is what we give the guru the right to do, to help us toward our soul freedom. And so Martha was open, and he knew it. And so he could give her input so she could grow closer to God realization, to self-realization. I've been doing these noon broadcasts now since the beginning of the pandemic. And currently, I've been reading from Swami Kriyananda's autobiography, The Path, The New Path. And I'm in the chapter called Work versus Meditation. And I've been in that chapter for well over a month, maybe even 2 months, because virtually every little sentence or vignette in there has spiritual guidance on this particular topic. And all of the guidance is that it's not work versus meditation, it's work and meditation. That the more we meditate and experience that stillness within, be still and know that I am God. The more we can experience that stillness, we can then take it into our activity and into our service. But it's something we have to practice. Like in meditation, it doesn't, for most people that I know, it doesn't just come, that stillness. The restless mind, the sleepy mind, you name it. You know, it doesn't just come. We have to be awake and ready, alert, and pay attention to the divine within. And then take that into our activity. Relate to people from soul to soul, not from ego to ego. See where there's a need. Try to be helpful. Try to be serviceful. That's the practice. But it takes practice, doesn't it? That's why they call it practicing the presence of God. There is the presence of God, but we have to practice it, if you follow my meaning. When I speak on this topic, I've shared through the years, now and then, an experience that we had when we were visiting Ananda in Assisi. And we went with a few friends to Larimau, which is the place where St. Francis and his brothers would go periodically. There were caves there in the mountain. And they would go there for long periods of seclusion in those caves. And it's an incredibly powerful place to go and meditate. Well, they assigned this monastic, this monk, to a Franciscan brother to be our host, you know, to show us around. And he was telling our group about the place, and then he said, and I should say first what sadly, my impressions of him were. I noticed he had brand new, really expensive sandals on, and he had, a pretty slick hairdo, which oven by itself is not a bad thing. And it's not what I'm saying is a bad thing, but I could feel his ego slightly, a little bit cocky there in what he was saying. And so what he was explaining was that when St. Francis lived, he would divide up the monastics, half to be in the temple, the church and pray, the chapel, and pray and meditate, for the other half who would go out to serve. And so those going out to serve felt supported prayerfully, remembered more easily what they were doing. They were more conscious of God as they were doing it. And then periodically they would switch. So the other half would pray and meditate, and the other half would go out and serve. And to me, that seemed brilliant as a spiritual practice. And this monk said, but we don't do that anymore. That's sort of old-fashioned. That was for those times. And my heart just sort of broke, because we have a saying, when the bird and the book disagree, follow the bird. When St. Francis in modern times disagree, follow St. Francis. He was onto something there, and they seem to have missed it. Anyway, I found that particular counsel very inspiring. I'd like to just take a minute and digress, because I came across something else in this chapter, and even though it's not totally directly on point, I want to share it. He says, he's talking about the fact that everything is vibration, and that what we're trying to attune ourselves to when we're serving, be in God remembrance, and attune ourselves to the vibration of God remembrance of the divine in that other person that we're serving. And so, speaking on that topic, now he's relating it to music and what happens. And he says, a sensitive person may enjoy music on a record player in their home, but if they hear that same music played by live musicians, they're almost sure to recognize in it a greater vibrancy and power, even if the musicians are less gifted than the recording artists. I thought, wow, that just sort of made me think about these pandemic times and the online. I know for us, it's been a challenge to learn how to teach on Zoom to people. I mean, we do it, and when there is a pandemic and it is the only safe thing to do, by all means, it's better to have something than nothing. But the vibration exchange, the vibrational exchange is not the same. It's lessened somehow. We've been doing hybrid classes where, half or more of the class has actually been coming in person. And having people there in person just draws out of us more inspiration and teaching to share than on a screen. It's interesting, but it's subtle, but it's different. And I'm not saying to come if you're unwell or if it just isn't appropriate to be in public for you yet. But if you can come, and if you are well, take the time, put out the energy to do it, because there is a difference. And he goes on to describe that there are people and places that just bring out sort of a happy feeling for us. And that made me reflect on this temple and the land that we're on. When we first found it, we called it the Happy Land. And it worked out. We were able to purchase it. And it had incredibly tall, gorgeous trees on it. And our hearts were all breaking for the fact that many of them would have to come down to make room for the temple. So we actually called for a day where many of us came together in the grove of trees, and we talked to the trees, and we prayed and meditated with the trees, and we explained what it is that we were hoping to do there, and basically asked their permission to do it. And it was a beautiful day, and we really felt their approval, their joy, and, you know, a beautiful, happy place came out of it too, this temple. And what's interesting in relation to today's topic is that this temple and this Sangha represents that perfect place to practice seva, service, and meditation, both and.